The Sicilian is sharp and complex, but a universal system cuts through the theory. This simple setup works against most lines and gives you easy development with solid middle game plans. In the universal anti-Sicilian system, once black enters their typical Sicilian setup, white simply develops with knight to f3. After black replies with their usual Sicilian defense move, you avoid the standard development with knight to c3. Instead, you can choose a smarter and more practical approach. Entering the main lines of the Sicilian defense, move knight to f3 requires memorizing a huge amount of theory, whether it is the Najdorf variation, the dragon variation, the Scheveningen, the classical Sicilian, the pawn e5 systems, and many others. There is simply too much to learn. Instead, the setup I recommend is to defend the central pawn with the move pawn to f3. We intentionally delay developing the knight because we want to keep the pawn on c2 free. After black makes any reasonable move, you continue with pawn to c4. The beauty of this system is that your next several moves are almost automatic. You could practically get a coffee and return to the board with a comfortable middle game advantage. After playing pawn to c4 and ignoring whatever black does, you calmly develop your minor pieces and bring everything toward the center. This pawn structure makes it extremely difficult for your opponent to advance or create counterplay. You have already taken away many of the key squares they would normally use to attack. If black continues with something like bishop to g7, you simply continue centralizing your minor pieces and reaching a solid, harmonious setup. After completing development of your minor pieces, you castle and begin activating your heavier pieces. The typical next step is to place the rook on c1. In some positions, white can immediately launch an attack, but to fully understand the system, it's helpful to follow the traditional, structured approach. In the classical setup, you continue by centralizing your strongest pieces. You bring the queen to d2, and then the rook to d1. With this, every piece is perfectly placed, and your position becomes as stable and powerful as possible. Now, if you examine black's position, you'll notice how restricted their movement is. Their knight has almost no useful squares, as everything is controlled. Their bishop on b7 is passive, aiming at a pawn that is safely protected. Many of black's typical pawn breaks become difficult or even impossible. Pushing the central pawn, for example, leaves weaknesses behind that white can immediately exploit. Overall, this structure creates a very uncomfortable and limited position for black, while white enjoys harmony, space, and long-term strategic pressure. You've now reached a superior middle game position almost effortlessly, simply by following a series of natural moves. The next logical question is how to handle the middle game itself, but that is an entirely separate topic. In general, the typical plan is to expand gradually on the queen side with moves like pawn to b4 and a steady advance, gaining more space and improving piece activity. Even without deep calculation, the structure already gives white excellent prospects. Returning to the earlier position, white also has the option to launch an immediate attack. A common idea is to advance the knight to d5, directly challenging the queen. This move is extremely unpleasant for black. If black captures on d5, the c-file opens, allowing the rook on c1 to apply instant pressure. At the same time, white's knight can leap to the powerful outpost on c6, from where it attacks multiple important squares and severely restricts black's movement. In such positions, black quickly runs out of useful plans, while white's activity continues to grow, often leading to a decisive advantage. In the game, black tried to avoid these problems by retreating the queen to d8, hoping both to escape the attack and continue defending the pawn on e7. However, this did little to improve the position. White continued with the powerful knight jump to c6, and from that moment the situation became a complete disaster for black. After the queen shifted to e8, white could simply capture the pawn and win material, but the move knight to c7 was even stronger. At this point, both of black's major pieces were essentially trapped. White's knights controlled all the key squares, leaving black with no meaningful defensive resources. Faced with a hopeless position, while studying this opening, I also came across another game that truly amazed me. White broke almost every classical rule, playing something close to a bong cloud-style attack. And astonishingly, it turned out to be the best move in the position. It was surprising, creative, and completely mind-blowing. We'll return to that surprising idea shortly, but first let's look at another useful tactical motif in this system. In this game, black chose a slightly different setup, but once again, it hardly matters. We continue with the same straightforward sequence. Develop the minor pieces, castle, and bring the rook to c1. From this square, the rook supports the c4 pawn when needed, and, as we've seen, becomes extremely valuable in middle game attacks. Black then played pawn to b6, preparing to develop the light-squared bishop. In the earlier example, the pawn on e6 was not present, so white could jump directly into d5 to start the attack. Here, the square appears to be defended, but in this variation, it is still very common for white to leap into d5 anyway, targeting multiple sensitive squares in black's camp. The key tactical point is that after black captures the knight, white recaptures with the c-pawn. This immediately opens the c-file for the rook. The knight on c6 becomes pinned to the queen, and on the next move, white wins back the sacrificed piece, often gaining additional positional advantages in the process. Once black makes any move, you simply win back the sacrifice piece and emerge a pawn ahead with a completely dominant position. Your knight on c6 becomes a powerful force, your rook on c1 is perfectly placed on the open file, and your bishops apply steady pressure along the long diagonals. Black's pieces are cramped, many of their squares are taken away, and they struggle to make even basic progress. In many cases, the game is practically won already. Let's also look at two common counterattacking tries from black. One of the most frequent is the advance pawn to e5, attacking your knight. In this case, you simply retreat the knight and continue with the same plan. Nothing in your setup is disturbed. In fact, the move pawn to e5 actually harms black more than it helps. The pawn on d6 becomes permanently weak because it no longer has support, and the square d5 turns into a lasting outpost. Since black can never push the pawn back to cover it, your knight can later land there with tremendous effect. Overall, even black's counterplay ends up reinforcing white's long-term strategic advantage. Another idea black sometimes tries is to pressure the pawn on c4. At first glance, this may look uncomfortable, but there are actually two reliable ways to deal with it: a strategic solution and a tactical one. The strategic method is to bring the knight to d5. This move blocks the bishop's diagonal so it can no longer target the c4 pawn, and at the same time it puts pressure on several key points in black's position. After the exchange on d5, white simply advances the pawn forward, gaining even more space. This pawn also restricts black's knight by taking away the c6 square. From here you follow your usual plan, develop the bishop to e3, place the rook on c1, attack down the open file, and continue your development smoothly. Everything remains comfortable for white. There is also a tactical approach where you intentionally allow black to carry out the capture. In this example, white played bishop to e3, essentially saying, if you want the pawn, you can take it. This invites black to commit to the capture, which later backfires due to white's superior activity and coordination. Black accepted the pawn, but this actually played directly into white's plan. White immediately brought the rook to c1, and suddenly black's position collapsed under the pressure. Both of black's pieces on the queenside came under heavy attack from the rook, leaving black with no adequate defense. In the game, black captured on f1, but white did not even need to recapture. Instead, white launched the powerful move knight to b5, attacking the queen and creating immediate threats. If black wants to avoid losing the queen, it must move. Yet once it does, white jumps in with knight to c7, forking the king and the rook. From there, white can win the rook, or even choose the simpler route of capturing the bishop first, since the rook cannot escape due to the controlled squares. In either case, the result is an easy and convincing win for white.